Since March of 2020, so much has changed. How we work, how we live, the tools we use, the way we collaborate. Hello and welcome to The Bridge. Join host Scott Kinka in a series of discussions of how some of the top leaders in technology bridged their businesses, technology, roadmaps, and lives into their new hybrid work reality. Our hope is that their insights and experiences will help you on your journey in business and in life, from who we were to who we are today. And maybe it'll help you get better prepared for whatever comes next. The Bridge is a service of Bridgepoint Technologies, one of the nation's leading IT advisory, procurement, and lifecycle management companies. Now, here's your host.
Hi, and welcome to The Bridge. I'm your host, Scott Kinka. My guest on this episode of The Bridge is Terry Barbounis. He's the Director of Innovation and Strategy at Lumen, or a Director of Innovation and Strategy at Lumen. By his explanation, he gets paid to daydream, and his focus is on edge, a phrase we hear every day, and assuming, frankly, we all know what that means. Terry is himself a podcast host of Lumen's podcast, Light, Data, Action. We'll give you some information in the liner notes to make sure you can check that out. He's also, by his definition, a reformed stand-up comic. He's got a silky radio voice. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit jealous of that. Terry talks in big concepts, and I love that. But he also does a great job of making them simple. His definition, or explanation, I should say, of edge as an example during the pod was particularly compelling. You know, why is it important now? Is this new tech or a new need? And the answer, in a lot of ways, is both, right? We've moved critical apps to the cloud from the office data center. We've moved people out of the office as a result of the pandemic. So while the regional pops of a traditional tier one telco provider like Lumen, might be less important, perhaps as a means to deliver last mile to offices that may sit in the WAN, they're frankly more important now as a means to get microservices, content, availability, and applications closer to the users and to the applications themselves out in the field. We get into quite a bit on that. Moving to softer topics, though, we talked a lot about our new normal and the concept of busyness, or measuring value and productivity based on hours and not output, and how that's culturally started falling apart, right? Primarily because of the concept of office work has changed. And the way we think about it, the way we talk about it, our culture hasn't really caught up. I mean, I won't spill the popcorn. You'll have to listen to the episode to get a little bit more. We got a little AI nerdy in the conversation, talked a bit about pending regulatory government oversight, how close we are to the singularity, or the moment when AI achieves self-awareness, something we've been concerned about since, the sci-fi of the 30s and 40s, frankly. What struck me most, though, in listening to Tony throughout the chat, and as I look back on the notes, is that Terry's opinions are all still really about people. They're people-centered. We talk about collab and AI and robotic process automation and the dawn of a new era, and yet people have never been more at the center of how we run our businesses post-pandemic. Is technology driving people, or are people driving technology? Or is it both? This was a great, intellectually honest chat that I really appreciated, and I hope you find it as compelling as I did. Here is my chat with Terry Barbounis, Director of Innovation and Strategy at Lumen Technologies. Hi, and welcome to The Bridge. I'm your host, Scott Kinka. My guest today is Terry Barbounis from Lumen. He's the Director of Innovation and Strategy, as well as R&D. I think he's chief cook and bottle washer, self-professed cheese snob, and podcast host. Is that right? Did I get it all in there, Terry?
That's about right. It's striking, but yeah, that's about right.
What does Director of Innovation Strategy for Lumen do? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I'm part of, and I'm a Director of Innovation Strategy.
Okay.
I'm not the only one, but product innovation, specifically edge product innovation for Lumen. So my team focuses on taking emerging technologies and trends, pairing it with a business problem, and then seeing if we can create a prototype for something that solves that problem, that we can then create all of the innovation assets and the use cases and everything else, and then bundle that up and eventually send it to our product folks to develop into a full-blown product. Doesn't always happen, but that's sort of the motion.
So you are at the
Somebody
edge,
else that's,
you are at the edge, literally and figuratively. Then,
yeah, I tell people I get paid to daydream. We have somebody else on I have somebody else on my team, one of my colleagues, that says he always tells people that he creates magic carpets, which I think is awesome. But
I like that too. I like that too. So said another way, you're skunk works inside of Lumen.
yeah, exactly, and and all of that falls under some form of R&D. So I'll typically tell somebody I'm product innovation R&D. But yeah, we take ideas, and in my case, specific to all things edge. We take ideas, we take customer, existing business problems, and try to solve for them. At least prototype something that solves for it, and then kind of take it through the innovation lifecycle.
Terry, before we jump all the way into the nerdy stuff, tell us more about you. Where you're from, something fun from your history, whatever it is that's interesting. Help us know a little bit about Terry.
Yeah, so if you can't tell from my accent, which has a tendency to come out after a while, I currently live in Tucson, Arizona, but I'm actually from the Northeast. I grew up in northern New Jersey, about 50 miles outside of New York City. I was actually born in Istanbul. People find that interesting. English is a second language to me. I'm fluent in Greek, and I know enough Turkish to be very, very dangerous, so I try not to speak Turkish. I actually started my education wanting to be an architect, like a building architect, and backed into technology back when things like AutoCAD were running on specific hardware, silicon graphic machines and Intergraph, and kind of backed into technology. My first job was at AT&T when they were headquartered in New Jersey, and they still had the great Bell Labs. And so I think that's where I cut my teeth in hanging around people that are much smarter than I, to learn and grow from that. Spent a little time. Another interesting thing is I spent a little time in college. I tell people I was painfully shy growing up. Nobody wants to believe it now. They think it's just a story I tell. But the reason that's significant is because by the time I got to college and I kind of found my own voice, I was convinced to try my hand at stand-up comedy. And so I did a couple of years of stand-up, and that I parlayed later in my professional career into public speaking, things like podcasts and things like that. So it was sort of these pivot points that I had that allowed me to grow. And then when you combine those, in 2023, when technology is coming at us, thought leadership is as important as ever, but being able to get down into the tactical is important as well. I've been fortunate to be able to parlay that into something that I feel I have an influence, or I can have an influence in, the way people think about technology, the way people think about work today, and other things. So
that's amazing. Tell us more about the podcast, Lights, Data, Action. Did I get that right?
Light, Data, Action. It's obviously a play on lights, camera, action. The light data action came from the fact that, Lumen and its, predecessor, CenturyLink and Level 3 and everything that went into creating what we call Lumen Technologies today was predominantly a tier one telco provider, which we still are today. And so the idea is light, as in, fiber, data is the lifeblood of everything that we do today. And then the action is the insights that we take on that data. So I found that may be a catchy way to create a podcast whose purpose, the idea of the podcast came out of, going back to the stand-up and the public speaking. Every time I would present, both internally and externally, somebody would come up to me and say some combination of, "This is really great. We'd love to have you do more." Somebody came up to me and say, "You should be in broadcasting," which I'm not sure if I'm the right person to be doing a morning show, but that could be interesting. And so what I wanted to do is take something I love to do, like we're doing now, is find a topic within technology business, and expound on it with somebody who's equally passionate about it, and talk about it the way I typically talk around, the proverbial water cooler in the office or on a daily basis now, being within product innovation, to to kind of go back and forth. What does it mean and so forth, and appeal to an audience that's not just executives. It's not just technical professionals, right? It's not just an audience of engineers. It's an audience that says, I hear this term metaverse all the time, and it's interesting. It sounds cool. If I had an opportunity, I'd love to know more. Why should I even care? And so basically we launched this podcast last year in season 2 now to create a thought leadership perspective on those topics, find interesting people to chat with, and hopefully create, 35, 40-minute episodes that somebody could listen to and walk away saying, that was interesting. I'd love to know more. Or more importantly, as a thought leadership avenue channel for Lumen, for somebody to ask more questions about how Lumen could help in those areas that maybe we talked about.
Certainly, and interesting. We'll make sure that we include some information on that in the show notes. So to our listeners, while you're giving us a thumbs up or a like or a sub, which we're going to instruct you to do, obviously today, we will want you to do the same on Terry's podcast, Light Data Action, which is sponsored by Lumen, and we'll make sure that that's in the show notes as well. Terry, you went through very quickly a history of the combined companies that are now, part of Lumen. And, I'm 25 years in this industry, so I'm super familiar and was partnered at various times with all of them at one time or another. But for those who maybe aren't familiar with what Lumen is today, or maybe don't have a great feeling on that history, can you give us the Terry Barbounis, elevator pitch? Lumen is, Lumen does, what's the superpower we should be thinking about on Lumen's front?
Yeah, I think from a purpose and mission perspective, kind of the why and what. The purpose is trying to further human progress through technology. Now that sounds lofty, but that's essentially at the end of the day what we're trying to accomplish. It's one of the reasons I'm in technology, because I'd like to think that we can solve real problems with technology, not just do it because it's cool. From a mission perspective, which gets more tactical, it's to digitally connect people, data, applications, and do so quickly, securely, and effortlessly. So you look at Lumen as an organization that's really a conglomeration over the last decade plus of certainly telcos, CenturyTel, Embark, Savis, that was the 800-pound gorilla in the day for managed hosting. That's where I got my start, by the way, in this organization. I came in as the practice lead for media and entertainment for Savis. So you had that component, and then a series of other acquisitions, that became CenturyLink, and then the acquisition with Level 3, where ultimately it was looking at what our customers were asking for, looking at what we can do with this massively peered network, arguably the largest IP data network in the world from a peering perspective, imbued with security superpowers. If you look at what we can do, when you take the world's largest IP data network and turn it into the world's largest threat sensor, there's a lot of stuff you can do and help prevent or mitigate with that. And then when you look at taking thousands of physical locations that were formerly network colo facilities for the network gear, and you look at the side of the business that sort of waned, people aren't buying traditional landlines anymore, then you look at those facilities and you say, well, what if I retrofitted them and I turned them into mini data centers, these edge nodes? Because there's thousands of them. I can literally put them anywhere in locations where a traditional internet data center doesn't reside. And so the idea was you build this platform that has a combination of connectivity, edge, managed services, and security with these physical locations. And now I can turn to a customer, which I often do, and I ask the question, if I gave you a massively peered network that was imbued with security superpowers, threat detection, and other things, and then I gave you, say, 100 locations within North America that I can give you 5 milliseconds or better of latency, ultra low latency, what would you do with that? And there's a ton of use cases that we can meet with that. And so that's essentially where we are now with Lumen, is you take sort of this foundation of building this massive network with 450,000 route miles of fiber, and buildings on net and connectivity into all the major hyperscalers, how can I enable somebody who has an application that is for a first responder that needs to work anywhere they are? How do I enable an application like that?
There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. And I'm going to answer partly the question that you just asked with taking it one step up. We use the word edge all the time in our industry. And it's, I'd say that's a more recent phenomenon based on the way that our work styles have changed and the kind of things we're trying to cram over the wire, right? Let's be honest,
Right.
have changed in terms of their requirement for bandwidth and ultra low latency. For maybe somebody who doesn't understand kind of the evolution of carrier services in America, right? And the way the internet's grown. Can you give us a simple definition? This is your focus at Lumen, right? A simple definition of what we mean by edge, and why is it more important now?
So Lumen has always kind of aligned with the definition that's probably close to what you get from Gartner, for example.
Yep.
It's moving the interactions close to or next to the data, right? And so we've used traditional data centers forever to collect data. And once you start collecting data, whatever that data is, it builds a certain gravity. That data starts attracting applications that consume it. It starts attracting additional data and so forth. Well, if you're in a situation where you're a retailer and you want to do robotic stock shelving, and you need to run that robotic software somewhere, which is heavily dependent on being ultra low latency, the public cloud may not work for you. Mm-hmm. Because depending on where that public cloud data center is and where your physical locations are, the latency might just be too high. And so the way that we look at edge today is, first of all, it doesn't replace on-premises and it doesn't replace public cloud, right? If you look at on-premises and public cloud as either sides of a continuum, our edge network, or metro edge as we call it, kind of sits in the middle. It's this idea that retailer that's sitting in the Midwest somewhere that has tried to run ultra low latency applications by using an East Coast, West Coast, some data center belonging to a hyperscaler, a public cloud provider, where the latency is too high. We likely will have an edge node because, again, they used to be network colo facilities. We needed them to be able to give you a landline at your house, so they are everywhere. I likely have an edge node that's within 250, 300 miles of that facility to be able to give you the type of latency that software needs. And so the foundational definition is I can move everything you need to act on that data to where that data is. And I can also allow you to create hybrid solutions because of the connectivity of that network with on-premises and public cloud. I can now come to you in a very agnostic manner and say, Scott, here's what I want to know. What are the operating criteria that you put on your application? Mm-hmm. And once we understand that, I can help you get all or portions of that application in the appropriate execution venues. Some of it may need to stay on-prem because of some unique requirement. Some of it works just fine in public cloud. But more and more use cases today, you really can't do unless you're in an environment where you're right next to the data and you're in an ultra low latency scenario from a connectivity perspective.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, look, that's and you tell it's a cool story, certainly, right? The robotic shelf stocking being the application that needs ultra low latency, but situationalize that for us if you would, because that's cool and uncommon, right? What's common is people not being in big shiny buildings anymore. So can you share with us a little bit how kind of edge has proliferated as a strategic way of building applications? Also because humans aren't crammed into big buildings anymore. Like, tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, I think if you just look at applications, I think these large monolithic applications have been waning, right? If you look at companies, the innovative companies like Netflix, Uber, and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
there's a couple of things that they have in common. They're both companies that have applications, and they're companies that have built services using microservices, right? So the application is broken up into hundreds, if not thousands of pieces, and each piece is a specific piece of functionality. If you, the example I give to people is when you go and you shop at Amazon.com and you go to checkout, the part of your shopping cart that calculates what your shipping will be based on your zip code is a microservice.
Yep.
Just that piece. And so when you start looking at being able to build applications this way, if you then attach to it what we saw over the last 2 or so years with the pandemic, people are not in buildings. They're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you have to start looking at what am I going to use as infrastructure and networking to create to create services that allow my employees, my people, to be able to work from anywhere at any time on any device.
Yeah.
Right. And so by doing that, it completely changes the focus. And so if you look at the edge network, if I am, again, a company that's running an application that's running out of headquarters, and I can VPN into it, but I'm still VPNing into a central location, if I'm no longer using that, if I sell that building, where do my applications go? I can put them in a traditional data center, but more and more we start seeing these distributed applications that kind of reside all over, quote unquote, all over, that depending on where I'm connecting from, it's allowing me to be able to get access that I need when I need it with the performance that I need.
Yep.
A lot of that, obviously, we've had SaaS around for a while, things like Salesforce and everything else, but we start to see the evolution of that more so with the more mainstay enterprise applications.
Got it. So, on one end, getting the application closer to the, robotic endpoint or the place that, needs that ultra low latency. The flip side is getting people closer to the application, right? And in a lot of ways, I mean, one of the questions, Terry, that I generally ask in here is, how has your company's approach to the market changed to go along with hybrid work? And in a lot of ways, we've kind of already answered that, right? I mean, you basically said, we had these network endpoints all over the place to service last mile. We were network provider traditionally. And the idea was, hey, man, we've got this liquid gold to be able to get services out closer to the edge because we're already living in the neighborhoods, right? I mean, we're effectively out to, pun intended, the last mile, right? Before connectivity, where you're still on, you're on Lumen gear at the end of the day. Is that a good way for me to be thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, the way it actually went down for us starting in, March 2020 is the first requests we got were for connectivity. We were doing everything from, an organization that has 10% of people on any given point that are working remotely. They have X number of VPN connections. Say they have 100. All of a sudden, there's 1,000 people working remotely. And I'm making these numbers up for the sake of the anecdote. Yeah. They don't have that many VPN connections. And so it started with that. Mm-hmm. And once it went from that and people said, okay, this is going to be the norm. Then the next thing, and I got this was an actual, from the CIO of a major luxury retailer talking about this exact subject. So first we make sure we have connectivity for people to connect. Great. Now we take a look at things and we go, we're going to get a downturn. How do we start reducing things? And so, the CIO tells a story. I was calling Lumen. I was talking to other providers saying, you need to cut this, cut this, cut this. At some point, there was an epiphany that said, you can't just cut everything and expect to still try to get through this, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, the epiphany was, how do we still create value for our customers so that we continue having them as customers and move forward? And so that started conversations about, I have a project that I was working on prior to the pandemic. Can you help me with it? And that conversation may lead to, hey, you're going to run that ERP system locally. Why don't we run it? Why don't we set you up to run that in public cloud? as a managed service so you don't have to worry about it, right? And that slowly started getting further into the enterprise. What else can we do? And the net, at least for this luxury retailer, is that after the pandemic, during the pandemic, they were able to get 3 million new users coming to their site, double what they were getting in 2019. So in the middle of a pandemic with that mindset, and again, using their providers like Lumen,
Sure.
they were actually able not only to create value, but to show that you can operate in pretty adverse conditions and are now set up, because that's my next question. So do you feel you're ready to go if, God forbid, the next pandemic or natural disaster comes along? Absolutely. And so for us, it became progressive, it became connectivity. And then what else can you do for us? Because we're not going to be able to do it alone. And in a lot of cases, we created some, fantastic relationships, even from a product innovation perspective, to have some of those companies now after the fact come back and say, you guys helped us get additional VPNs or network in the beginning. We're now working on our next big bet. We'd love to co-innovate with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, in a lot of ways, people did that knowing they were going to have to undo it, right? I mean, we've talked often on this pod about how much bandwidth we all sold in March, April, and May of 2020 to get people to the office, only to get them back out to the internet, right? Just to hit their company's security edge, which was sitting inside because they're so used to the big buildings. I want to read something back to you, though. You said in that great answer, you said, okay, so this is going to be the norm. So, and then you finished answering the question. I want to take it a slightly different way. Are we at our norm? I mean, you talk to business owners all the time, and I found it very difficult to, over the course of the past couple of years, to advise technology leaders on what to do when the CEO hadn't decided what to do just yet, right? It's kind of hard to figure all that out. How do you build a technology strategy for, I'm not quite sure where everybody's going to sit. Do we have a normal yet in your mind based on the conversations you're having?
I don't know what normal is, quite honestly. Yeah, I think what we have is we definitely have a different mindset that still needs work. And here's some examples. We have the mindset, at least. One of the other things that I heard over the last few years is with things like cloud and now edge. So for some companies, it was always cloud first. Or right from the beginning, the leadership said, you know what, we're going to look at cloud first before we deploy anything, and then we'll go down from there. For other companies, cloud was, we don't need it. Financial institutions is a perfect example. Yeah, we're good. We're a financial institution. This is what we do. We've always done it that way. Almost every single CIO that I spoke to after, during and then through the pandemic, has said cloud first is now not only a thing, right? We're going to look at cloud first, but we've even built, in some cases, departments for cloud economics to help calculate what the costs are. So we have traceable accountability that says, we went to public cloud or edge. Here's why. Here's the spreadsheet with all the numbers. Mm-hmm. So I think that was good in terms of mindset. I think where we still struggle on the culture side. And quite honestly, in some cases, the culture side can't necessarily be solved with technology. And the culture side is that things changed around the culture. People were no longer in a building. They were all working in a distributed fashion. But we still try to hang on to a culture that was built on people all working together and so forth, right? A culture that was built on how much activity are we doing? Are Terry and Scott working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday? And we're in a culture now more than ever that I think we need to redefine. Harvard Business Review just did a whole story on busyness. We have to not define what we do by the inputs, whether Terry worked 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but what Terry produced by the outputs. I think that's where we still struggle a little bit. I think when it comes into the technologies, everything in between, I think, the pandemic didn't necessarily invent new technologies. It certainly took projects that were, in a lot of cases, already in flight and accelerated them by a number of years in some cases. I think it certainly has changed the way we think about how we work in an environment where we're not centrally located. And I think when you start talking about some of the the most emerging technologies today. And when you look at AI, ChatGPT, when you look at metaverse and enterprise metaverse, where we now take Microsoft Teams and instead you and I are both avatars, we're wearing goggles and we're in a room. I think there's still a little struggle because I think some of it is marketing. Some of it is our friends, the analysts that talk about this all the time and start making it an imperative. But I think that I think there's some stuff that's changed for the good, as I mentioned, but I think there's other things that we still need to work through. And I think going back to culture, I think culture needs to evolve because that'll evolve the processes. And then eventually, it'll touch on technology, but it's not going to go, you can't throw a piece of technology and say the culture is different now because that becomes a mindset that needs to change from the top down.
100%. Yeah. It's funny. We talk about, we have this phrase we use internally, I say it all the time. I'm like, don't be in the business of being in business. And, that has a lot to do with your inputs conversation, right? People that measure productivity on inputs aren't really measuring productivity. I mean, that's that's like the earlier conversation about saying, we're going to paper over bad endpoint security by putting everybody in the office and and securing the edge, right? It doesn't solve the problem. It just kind of papers it over, right? But it is an interesting way of thinking about it. What was that commercial? The guy's like in the glass office, like, I'm busy right now.
That's right.
Well, just because they're working, right? At the end of the day, I mean, we definitely have broken through that. At least the idea that I've got to be sitting in a desk, I've got to drive an hour or sit in a desk. If I'm the earliest person to show up and the last person to leave, I'm the one working the hardest or producing the most. At the very least, I think culture still needs to, I should say our tools to be able to measure need to catch up. But I think we've at least probably gotten to a point where, we realize that that's not actually a real measure. I don't know.
And I think the one other thing, and I think the one other thing, before I answer that question, the one other thing I think that has changed, or the thought process behind it is, when we go through things like this, much like in financial markets, when the bank isn't properly financed or leveraged too high, it's when you end up having one of these black swan events where now the emperor has no clothes. I think what happened in technology of these companies is, especially if there are companies like in retail that have grown through acquisition, is you end up accumulating all this technical debt.
Yeah.
Right. You kind of integrated when you bought that company, but not really. Now you have to go back and look at that and say, is it worth me even trying to tackle that? Or do I want to stand up a new project alongside of it, start doing it correctly, and start piecemeal bringing over functionality? And so that's a different mindset, part of which we've been pushed into because of the amount of technical debt and what we need to do. But yeah, I think in terms of the whole business thing, the other great term that I heard is the two things that I heard is, when you ask somebody how they're doing, one of the first things they'll say is, I'm busy. Right. And in that Harvard Business Review,
like it's a measure of success, right? Or happiness.
Exactly. Well, and it is, right. If you look at our entrepreneurial culture here with startups, the more you work, the more you're worth. And I think, and this goes back to what you and I have chatted about offline, I think part of what has really been illustrated here in almost all industries is a reminder that at least up to this point, AI isn't running businesses. People are, humans are.
Yeah.
And so I think when we talk about, you hear about technology, process, and people, never before have I seen people be moved up in terms of consideration. Because I think prior it was, we'll put in the right process and technology, people will take care of themselves.
Yeah.
I think we're in a different world now.
Until they didn't, right? I mean, that was the crazy part about sort of what we learned, which I think is a great stepping off point. Let's get into a little bit of fun before we go. I'm going to ask you, probably have an idea where it is already given some of the things that you said, but I'm going to ask you for a shameless prediction over the next 18 to 24 months. I don't care if it's in tech or sports or politics or macroeconomic, just not focusing on Lumen, more so at the industry level.
I think the way we think about metaverse changes. It changes, meaning that we've already seen that, Disney and other companies have moved away from the metaverse effort. I think within the gaming industry, it still considers to explode, but I think the consumer metaverse that most people know and understand what Meta was working on and so forth, I think changes dramatically. I think the use of metaverse as a follow through to a digital twin, meaning taking reality and putting it into a virtual world with real-time data being fed into it and a level of accuracy that allows you to do things within that virtual world that traditionally could only be done in physical. We see more and more of that. I think AI, we've already seen some of the backlash from ChatGPT and GPT, where you have linguists in particular saying you're training these models in a way, these models are being trained in a way where they can create misinformation and bias and things like that. It's not that we need to stop, but we need to take a breath and consider what's being built here. So I think AI definitely continues to be front and center for some time. I think those two
Do we
from
get
an
to
industry perspective.
I'll just pull the Asimovian approach to it, but you could pick whatever sci-fi you want, right? Because Roddenberry had his own approach on it, but it is an art imitating life kind of thing.
Sure.
Are we going to get to the 5 rules, kind of approach to AI? Is that what you think is going to happen with governments getting involved, or are we, we already moving?
I think it's, well, you saw Bloomberg already announced Bloomberg GPT, right?
Yeah.
So it's already, I think what ends up happening is I think we need to balance, and again, I can only predict up this point. A lot of this is just Terry's view from what I read, but I think as soon as you throw large sums of money into anything, then sometimes it has a tendency to put blinders on situations. I think it continues to move in that direction. We certainly, from a Lumen perspective, as being enablers to being able to train models like that and support that, we see it all the time because we talk to the vendors and customers and so forth. Do we get to AGI, the whole artificial general intelligence, which is, AI is on par with our brains? I think if we do, it's not going to be in the next 5 years or any time frame that has some people, a lot of people that are outside of the industry may not understand how these models work and what it takes to create an artificial human brain. I don't think we get to it with any speed. But I think with what we're doing, as I said earlier, I like to look at all technology from the perspective of what good can it do. I just think we need to take a little bit of a breath and to make sure that we're not creating something that could inadvertently, break out of Pandora's box, if you will, and do more harm than good.
But at least in Terry's view, 18 to 24 months, the singularity is not that near. Right?
No, I don't think we get. I think we're far from the singularity. For the same reason, by the way, that I think that full self-drive vehicles, if you look at what Tesla in particular has been doing and so forth, there's a lot to it. There's still a human component to all of this, right? If we still not at the point where you can rely on AI in your car to ensure you're not going to run into the back of a fire truck, which you saw was one of the incidents over the last couple of months with Tesla.
Isn't that the strangest juxtaposition about what's going on right now, though, too, in that, all this, everybody went home, all this tech, AI starting to get it going, and never have we actually valued the human more in work than when the technology is getting to this point of progress. That's really, really interesting when you think about all that. 2 more quick questions for you.
Yeah.
Whatever the next big event is, pandemic, Planet of the Apes outbreak, whatever you want it to, be in your own dystopian future. One application is continuing to work on your mobile device. What is that? What's your have to have?
I think my news feed app.
Okay.
I'm a one of the things to know about me is I've always been a voracious reader, and I still have this sense that I need to know a little bit about everything. And so I think I probably cull through what ends up being 1,000 blogs, news feeds that all come together in an application where I can quickly go through it, bookmark the ones I want to save to read later, read some blurbs, and it goes across finance, technology, food, everything.
Sure.
I I was doom scrolling before it was called doom scrolling, but I wasn't doing it from a doom perspective. I was doing it because I at least need to carve out some time on a daily basis to be able to look across those feeds and fill my brain with something. Almost every single time I learn something I didn't already know. And that's sufficient for me. If I can learn one new thing, and to some people it may be trivial, but to me it's satisfactory to know that I've learned one new thing today.
Well, I think that's a great segue into our last question. This is the easy one. So what's on Terry's end table? What are you reading? What's the business tome you're recommending? Is there, aside from your general news feed, is there something we should all be paying attention to right now that you're into kind of reading?
A lot of stuff on AI and linguistics.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of Gary Marcus, for example, who is one of these linguists and professors that has been talking about, hey, let's be careful with AI. But I'm also reading, Brene Brown's Dare to Lead book, because I think, you can never, one of the things I learned, and I've been doing this for about 30 years, half of which has been in a leadership role with an organization. You can never stop learning. The thing I've always heard about, the expression I've heard a long time ago that I love is, I will never say I'm the teacher. I'll always say I'm a student. And then I've got a new book on, I'm reading Harry McGee's food science book that basically talks about the scientific approach to why, you think you're doing the right thing by searing a steak, but it's doing something different. Again, completely different from the technology I do, but science nevertheless. And it ties into the, my other passion, which is, culinary food.
I love it. Terry, this has been super interesting. I appreciate your time on the pod today. We will certainly make sure that our listeners are aware of your podcast and give that a listen. Light Data Action. Terry has been with us again, is a director of innovation strategy and R&D focused on Edge at Lumen. And we've also learned that he is a futurist, a cheese snob, a food science guy, and an all-around Renaissance man. This has been a great chat, Terry. I've really enjoyed this time. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Bridge.
Thanks very much for having me, Scott. It was a pleasure.
And to all of you out there who've been listening, thank you for your time. And we're looking forward to seeing you on another episode of The Bridge in the future. Listen, if you made it this far, there must have been some good content, or you're just a fan or a relative of mine. In either case, we appreciate you spending your most valuable asset with us, your time. We don't take that lightly. We'd also like to say one more time that we are appreciative of Bridgepoint Technologies and their belief and sponsorship of this show. We hope that if you or someone you know is thinking about your company's digital transformation, or simply the next IT project that you may not have the resources, budget, or time to get to, I'm sure that Bridgepoint, one of the country's fastest growing technology advisory and procurement firms, can help. Check out Bridgepoint at bridgepointtechnologies.com. Don't forget the E on Bridgepoint, or simply reach out to me at Skinka, SKINKA, at bpt3.net. Also, take a minute, please, if you would, to give us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. It helps gives us the visibility to reach other people like you. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Bridge. I am Scott Kinka, and until next time, there's a lot of noise out there. In business and in life, do what you can to be the signal. Thanks.